So what happens next then? Does Syria turn into Libya, or are we going to see countries like Iran and Russia still try to get involved? But if Assad's gone, are they going to try to put him back into place, or are we going to see
Yeah,
what do
well,
you
I
see
don't think,
happening?
no, I think Assad is, yeah, it's over. It was his family ruled for over 50 years. That dynasty has ended. He's not returning. And Russia is not going to get involved again, nor do I think Iran will. Um, what are we looking, what can we expect for um, Syria now? Well, it looks quite dark. It could be just chaos. It could fall apart, kind of like Libya, or into a lot of because there are factions. There's actually more than one army that was involved in this offensive, and I think probably even within these armies there are factions. There are ISIS types, and there are Al Qaeda, and then there's some of them really are just belong to the Turks. Then you have the Kurds. There's already fighting, I believe, right now between um, uh, essentially Erdogan's army there, the one that he directly controls. I think he has a certain amount of control over it, but there's one that's specifically a Turkish army, and it is fighting the Kurds in northern Syria. So there's already that, and we'll see what happens. Um, so it could just break apart, and we may see warlords and just constant chaos. The Israelis probably want that. One thing is they've actually carried out extensive bombing in the last couple of days, after the fall of Assad. And it's not entirely clear to me what they're trying to achieve. They actually hit a number of government offices, and I don't know, like the customs office. I don't know what the purpose of that was. Maybe it's just to engender chaos. I'm not sure. And they also have seized some land, which we were expecting could happen, and they may seize more. We'll see. So it could just be one great mess, or perhaps this Al Jilani will have success in imposing his rule. He'll manage to unify the forces, and we'll have essentially an Al Qaeda state in Syria. Um, Now it may not be as bad as we've been fearing, but I think there's no question it's going to be bad. I mean, this guy is Al Qaeda. He even had a history with ISIS. He was some sort of like the ISIS deputy for a while, and um, I, probably a lot of us have seen a wanted poster of him. That's put out by the FBI. $10 million on his head, a $10 million reward for
Right,
his
there's a
his
bounty
capture.
involved for
Yeah,
him, but now
and
we're supporting him.
yeah, but that actually has not been removed. He's still that $10 million bounty is still in effect, but it may be removed soon. And we still, as of the current time, HTS is still a terrorist organization according to the United States government. I think that designation will be removed, conveniently. Again, I find there's a lot of similarities to like the relationship between the U.S. and Al Qaeda as there is between the U.S. and the ultranationalists in Ukraine. There used to be some complaints, and there was actual legislation passed, like to prevent weapons going directly to those ultra nationalists, to the Azov brigade in particular. Um, but then, when the war broke out, they ceased to be a problem. They were no longer neo Nazis or whatever. They were patriots fighting for Ukraine. Of course, they didn't change, but it was just we just changed the designation and put them to use. So I think we're going to see something very similar. Again, in fact, the U.S. has a long history of working with Al Qaeda. They did in Yemen. They kind of acted as the air force for Al Qaeda in Yemen, and they have done it so earlier in Syria, and it looks like they'll do it again. Now, it may be that uh, this Al Jilani seems like a clever guy, and he may try to restrain some of the more radical elements. Okay, he probably understands he can get away with a lot, but he can't get away with everything. He can't make it too obvious. So, we may have a slightly tempered form of of Al Qaeda ruling the country. But it'll be bad. There's just no question about it. Yeah.
Right, that does seem to be the image that the West is trying to give. I was watching BBC, CNN also had an interview with Al-Jilani. And I see the comments, people are like, hey, this guy doesn't seem that bad. He seems like a moderate, maybe he's good. So it does seem like the West is trying to paint that all of a sudden, whitewashing it.
Yeah, it's an old story. They do it again and again.
Right. So you think that there's basically two paths that Syria has in front of it now. One is it can descend into chaos like Libya did, which is horrific. I think actually probably worse than having someone like Al-Jilani in charge. What we saw happen to Libya or places like Somalia, where there's no rule of law, society breaks down.
Yeah, just armed gangs roaming the countryside.
Right. There were like open slave markets in Libya. It's horrific what happens when there's this complete power vacuum. So that's one horrific path that Syria might go down. The other is that HTS comes into control and is able to establish a government and is backed by the West now, backed by the United States, the Biden administration. Although Trump has made a tweet saying basically, that Syria is not a friend and we don't want anything to do with this.
Well, I read the tweets, but it just kind of is full of, he makes some valid points and then there's plenty of just nonsense in there and he contradicts himself. I just wouldn't pay that much attention to Trump's tweets, to be honest. I don't think there'll be much of a change in policy vis-a-vis Syria.
He was trying to remove the U.S. bases in Syria last term. So we don't really know where Trump stands on it, but the initial one is that he doesn't want involvement, but we see how much involvement that the West has. But clearly now it seems
but we are involved. We've occupied a big chunk of the country. That's it was the same thing. I remember reading a New York Times article, and it was sort of like, oh yeah, we're just disturbed about it. We don't really want to get involved. And nowhere in the article did it mention that the United States was occupying the eastern part of the country. So it's something that I think the memo went out. Don't talk about this. It looks bad.
Right. So then are you saying that the best really path for Syria at this point is to hope that HTS is more moderate than we hope? But these are
expect,
right? Yeah, but we have seen these head chopping jihadists, and that's what these people are.
That's what I mean. They're vicious, and so I think. Again, I think there's a good chance that, again, if he's able to impose rule, that he may try to restrain some of the most radical elements. And so some of the worst possible outcomes might not occur. We may not have widespread massacres or whatever, but I think there's no question there's going to be oppression and persecution of religious minorities. These people are... they're jihadists, they're sectarian extremists, they're Sunnis who, above all, seem to hate Shia, and Christians, but above all, there's this hatred for Shia. And it's interesting that they ransacked the Iranian embassy there, but they didn't touch the Russian embassy. And I think it reveals again, that they hate Hezbollah, they hate Iran, above all. It's something that's hard for us to understand. I remember like all the years when there's a lot of talk about radical Islam. We were aware of attacks on Westerners, of course, naturally, because we're Westerners. But for like every Westerner that was killed, easily 100 Shia were killed. Again, like most of this war, the sectarian war being waged by the Sunni radicals is really directed against the Shia. We talked about that some later, and we had said that that really characterized the Middle East to a great extent. You go back 10, 15 years. And it was, it explained a lot of what was happening in Syria. But since then, that Sunni-Shia divide, that rift has, to some extent, has been healed, thanks to the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And I think also just the obvious successes and valiant behavior of Hezbollah and the Houthis that certainly had effects, certainly on the Arab street, on the Sunni people. But a lot of these governments, and it has to be said, certainly a fraction of their populations have clearly retained this hatred, this Sunni hatred of the Shia. And it never, for example, Al Jazeera is one of the, it provides coverage, of course, of the Middle East. It's probably the best known news network in the Middle East. And they've done very good coverage of Palestine, what's been happening in Gaza, exposing the horrors there. But they never lost their anti-Shia bias. I wasn't paying attention, but I know that like Kevork Almasyan, the Armenian from Aleppo, that he pointed that out. It was clear, that they always skewed their coverage of what was happening in Lebanon or Syria. They're still on the side of the Sunni extremists. And then, you want to explain the behavior. I remember you were asking earlier, like, why do they want to chop off heads and so on? Again, it's just that it's really above all, it's the hatred of the Shia as being, the heretics of the Muslim world. That I think they believe that they need to purify Islam of the Shia. Of course, they don't have any affection for Christians either, but I think above all, it's the Shia that they hate.
It'd be scary. So
yeah.
do you see another option, or really it's just those two? HTS is going to be in control and backed by the West and Israel now.
Yeah.
And or chaos. Those are the two options.
Yeah, the main option. And then it's just sort of like a question of how, what kind of rule this al-Jilani manages to impose. Like how much, I think he will attempt to moderate again to some extent, because he understands he's a smart political operator, kind of like Erdogan. I think, Erdogan himself is kind of a closet, Sunni extremist. He comes from an Islamist family. And so he's actually very comfortable working with these people. It's not just, part of it is that he wants just to extend Turkish power, again, as he has these new Ottoman ambitions, but he's also a Sunni extremist. So anyway, he's maybe kind of like an Erdogan. Erdogan knows how to deal with the West, but also to use these forces. And he may prove to be very clever and maintain, establish very good relations to the West. Maybe the Americans will pull out. And that'll be, to his benefit. And a lot of people who don't have any affection for him and maybe, miss Assad, but they see that happen. They'll have to admit that this is a benefit for Syria. It'll strengthen his rule. That could happen. So we just see how again, to what extent he is able to control those extremist forces. And he just may not be able to control it. He may not even want to. We just don't know. We'll have to see what happens.